It must have felt like walking the plank, except in something like 42 degrees below zero, thousands of feet high, and accompanied by the sounds of German anti-aircraft artillery, whose only purpose was to take you out of the sky. Sergeant John Ramsey Omar was a flight engineer and turret gunner on an aircraft called the B-24 Liberator. His plane was nicknamed She's Our Gal. As the crew prepared to drop thousands of pounds of bombs on Magdeburg, Germany, one of their engines was hit and a rudder cable was severed. The bomb bay doors would not open. The crew would not be able to complete its mission. Omar realized he was going to have to open the bomb bay doors manually. He disconnected his flight suit and made his way along the 9-inch wide catwalk that ran from the cockpit to the waist door. Omar grasped a hold of the struts, which rose vertically on both sides of the narrow catwalk. He could see the earth below, and one misstep would mean certain death. Putting his hands on the cranks, he got the bomb bay doors open. Then, he caught some shrapnel in his foot. Later, Omar would be awarded a Purple Heart, but there was no time to think about awards right now. He was injured, and there was more work to be done. Omar had to repair the severed rudder cable so they could turn the plane around. There was no time to spare. Without one of their engines, they were losing altitude, and running out of fuel, too. They made a successful emergency landing at a little Belgian field, despite the fact that their fuselage had sustained 44 hits. Omar became severely ill, and an ambulance transported him to a hospital in Antwerp, Belgium. Diagnosed with double pneumonia, he fell into a coma. He awoke a week later to the sound of German bombs, some of which destroyed parts of the hospital. After a 41-day stay, Omar was released and told to return to his base. Since he had no idea how to get there, he asked a couple of military police officers for help. They gave him a train ticket to Brussels, and from there, he wandered around the city looking for the displaced prison center. When he arrived, Omar was told he had been listed as missing in action, and before letting him return to his base in England, military officials called his commander to confirm his identity. Once he fully recovered, Omar flew more missions out of his home base in Pickenham Airfield in Norfolk, England. As a member of the 491st Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, U.S. Army Air Corps, Omar flew a total of 29 missions during the war. During the Battle of the Bulge, a German offensive in which approximately 100,000 U.S. military personnel were killed or injured, Omar had another close call. Shortly after takeoff, in the middle of a massive snowstorm, his plane crashed. 11 of the plane's 500-pound bombs fell on the ground far enough away from the plane, but one hurled itself through the cockpit bulkhead just inches from Omar's back. Omar assisted the pilot as they both ran away from what they feared would be an explosion. Omar survived, and he was discharged in 1945. He opened Omar's Auto Electric service and worked there for 5 decades. Omar was also a member of the Islamic Center of New England, located in Sharon, Massachusetts. When he died, his obituary referred to him as Hajj John Omar, an honorific title given to those who travel to Mecca to perform the annual pilgrimage. Omar was one of perhaps 15,000 Arab-American men and women to serve in World War II. They went to Europe to fight the Nazi regime and the Italian army, and they served in the Pacific Theater, fighting the Empire of Japan. As in World War I, most of these Arab service members were from Lebanese and Syrian backgrounds, and perhaps 10% of them were Muslim. Many of the females who volunteered did so as nurses, although women also served in other roles, including the women Air Force service pilots. A woman named Anne Mohammed, for instance, signed up for the Cadet Nursing Corps at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, though for some reason did not complete her training. These were not the only Muslims to serve in World War II. The places of birth listed on Muslim draft registration cards include such locations as Afghanistan, Java, Malaya, Persia, Singapore, and Sumatra, countries whose dominant ethnic group are not Arabic-speaking people. For example, a man named Sharif Muhammad enlisted in 1943. A resident of New York, he was listed as coming from Balochistan or another part of the British East Indies. World War II marked the beginning of a turning point in the history of Muslim members of the U.S. military. In the second half of the 20th century, Muslim representation in the military came to reflect the ethnic and racial diversity of Muslim Americans themselves. The story of Muslim soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in the second half of the 20th century became a story of white, black, and brown Americans whose collective cultural heritage was echoed in the armed forces of the United States. They performed acts of heroism in combat, but they also served in peacetime and in non-combat roles. In the second half of the 20th century, Muslim Americans became important to military history in another way. Some African American Muslims became symbols of protest against mandatory military service and against U.S. wars in the developing world. The story of Muslim Americans in the military would be incomplete without including some consideration of those Muslims who refused, on principle, to serve.